What's one moment that made you go, that's it, I'm done?
I will start with the moment that set everything in motion, because if I start earlier, you will think I am exaggerating, and if I start later, you will miss the way a room full of polite people can turn into a spotlight you never asked for. So here it is in one breath. At my son's scholarship banquet, with committee members and donors, and those careful smiles people practice in the mirror, Ryan stood up to thank the adults who helped him get there, and in that very straightforward way he has. When he believes something is true and doesn't see any reason to pretty it up. He said that his mom did everything and his dad did nothing, and the room laughed the way rooms laugh when they think a teenager is doing a cute bit even though he is just telling the truth. And I clapped because I would not make his moment about me, and I felt Mark's eyes on me across the table like he was trying to nail me to the chair, and I chose to breathe, take a sip of water, and let the applause swallow. Whatever he wanted me to hear. There is a version of me that would have turned and said something sharp, something that would have tasted good for 5 seconds, and then kept me awake all night. But I have spent years learning that timing is not just a detail, it is the whole game. So I smiled and shook hands and hugged the coordinator who kept telling me I must be so proud, and I did not look at Mark when he did that half grin he uses when he wants credit for showing up, the one he saves for photographs and holidays, because I know the difference between attendance and parenting, and I also know he cannot stand losing the room. By the next afternoon the bill for that laughter arrived, not in words but in damage, and it started with Ryan calling me from outside the bursar's office. His voice lowered the way you lower your voice when you still believe problems can be solved if you speak gently to them, telling me that his tuition account had been frozen, and there was an automated note that said, "Earn your future." And could I please check because the window for payment was closing and he did not understand what he had done wrong, and I listened without interrupting because panic feeds on noise, and I told him to go to class, to put his phone on silent, to let me carry this part because I have carried heavier things for longer, and I know where the seams are. I set the phone down and opened the old blue folder I keep in the second desk drawer, the one that still smells like the copier at the courthouse, and I looked at the tabs the way a mechanic looks at a toolbox. Not because I love paperwork, but because I learned long ago that paper speaks clearly when people do not. So there was the decree with the clause about educational funds. There were the bank letters about the tuition payment plan. There were the screenshots from the university portal, showing limited third-party access with Mark's name spelled out exactly the way he likes to see it, and there were the emails from scholarship administrators who told me that any parental interference would be documented and reported in plain language. And I took all of that in like a checklist I had been practicing for years without admitting it out loud. I called Mark because you have to give a man like that a chance to tell on himself, and he answered with that performative side that says he is already the reasonable one, asking if I had enjoyed the little show at the banquet, and whether I thought it was wise to let a kid insult his father in a room full of people who could be references one day, and did I think hero worship would pay a single bill, and I listened as the edges of his voice sharpened when he said that a boy who wants to be a man can start by figuring out life without mommy's cushion, and that freezing the account would build character, and that he would consider turning it back on when Ryan apologized, and I let him finish, because sometimes the best evidence is unedited. And then I told him very calmly that I had recorded his last message about the freeze, that I would be forwarding the transcript to the university with the relevant clause highlighted, and that I would speak to him next through counsel. Before he could wind up again, I hung up, opened the university portal, and filed a formal revocation of his access using the custodial rights the court gave me, attaching the order that says educational funds fall under my sole discretion in the event of interference. Then I emailed the bursar with the paper trail and asked for a compliance hold on any parental actions taken in the last 48 hours. And while those requests moved through the system, I logged into the bank that services the payment plan and submitted a fraud inquiry citing unauthorized manipulation tied to a retaliatory act, which triggers an audit no matter how important a man thinks he is at his office. And then I sent Mark one message, 3 sentences long and chosen with care. Your access has been revoked. The university has your statement. If you need to respond, please do so through your attorney, and remember clause 14. People like to think that revenge is the loud part, the scene where someone flips a table or posts a video that goes viral, but the most effective moves are often the ones that feel administrative. The little doors you close quietly that lock bigger doors without anyone noticing until the hallway is already empty. So I made dinner. I sent Ryan a simple text that said I am on it, and you are going to be fine. And I did not perform outrage because outrage is a gift people like Mark know how to use. And I waited. By nightfall, my phone had stacked up with missed calls from Mark, from a number I recognized as his office line, from an unfamiliar number that tends to appear when a person wants to sound official without saying who they are. And I let them sit there flashing like a cheap scoreboard while the emails from the university arrived one by one, each confirming receipt and escalation, and I told myself that the next voice he would hear from me would not be a plea, it would be the sound of a door closing that he will remember, because he chose to turn my son's future into a lesson, and I am very good at teaching when someone asks for the wrong class. When Ryan called me again the next morning, his voice was caught somewhere between anger and fear, the kind of shaky tone kids get when they are still young enough to believe that fairness should count for something, but old enough to know that in real life it usually does not. And he kept repeating that he had gone back to the bursar's office, and they confirmed the freeze was still active, which meant his classes might be dropped if the account wasn't cleared, and then he said he had tried calling his father and gotten nothing but voicemail, so he wanted to know if there was anything I could do, because he felt like the rug had been pulled out from under him at the exact moment he was supposed to start running forward. I listened without interrupting, because I knew if I jumped in too quickly, he would take my calm for indifference, and I told him to keep his focus on his classes and let me deal with his father. Because I had handled worse from Mark and I was not about to let him take this victory lap at my son's expense. When I called Mark again, I caught him between meetings, or at least that is how he framed it, acting like his time was a commodity that should make me grateful for the few minutes he spared. And his tone had that smug satisfaction that men like him carry after they think they've made the decisive move, and he told me plainly that Ryan had embarrassed him in front of people he needed on his side, that it was disrespectful and unacceptable, and that letting him sit in the uncertainty of losing his tuition was, in Mark's words, a chance for him to learn humility, because he needed to understand that college wasn't a gift, it was an investment, and investors do not reward people who mock them in public. I wanted to laugh at how twisted his logic was, but I didn't, because laughing would have only fed the performance, and instead I told him that what he was calling an investment was, in fact, a legal obligation outlined in black and white, and that the only lesson Ryan would be learning from this was that his father was petty enough to sabotage his own son's education to soothe his ego. Mark didn't even bother denying it, and that was the moment I knew he had become reckless, because for years he had been careful, always hiding behind the ambiguity of half-promises and vague excuses, but now he had finally said it out loud. That this was about punishment, not principle, and the instant he confirmed it, I knew I had what I needed. He tried to end the call with a little flourish, saying that when Ryan was ready to apologize properly, he would consider releasing the funds, but until then it was out of my hands, and then he hung up, probably feeling like he had made his point. What he did not realize was that he had just given me exactly the leverage I had been waiting for, because I did not need him to admit guilt to me. I only needed him to admit it to himself, and the rest I could document. When the line went dead, I sat at the desk, opened the second drawer, and pulled out the folder I had avoided looking at for years. Not because it wasn't useful, but because I knew once I opened it there would be no more pretending that Mark could be managed with polite reminders and occasional threats of legal action. That folder was my insurance policy, the record of every late payment, every attempt he made to skirt child support, every court document he signed begrudgingly after a lecture about how I was ruining his finances, every letter from the bank confirming adjustments he had requested without my consent, every email thread in which he found creative ways to tell me that Ryan's future wasn't his problem. I had kept it all, not out of obsession, but because I knew men like Mark thrive when women like me throw things away and tell themselves they'll never need them. Flipping through the pages, I saw the patterns so clearly it almost looked rehearsed. Promises made, promises broken, threats disguised as advice, excuses stretched so thin you could see through them. And all of it wrapped in the same smug entitlement I had just heard on the phone. I realized that this tuition stunt wasn't some one-off act of cruelty. It was the natural conclusion of who he had always been, and the only mistake I had made was thinking he might eventually stop on his own. Ryan did not need to know all of this right now, because he was still holding on to the hope that his father would come around. But I knew better, and that folder in my hand was proof that his father had been burning bridges for years, one payment at a time. I closed the folder and placed it flat on the desk, and I sat there for a long minute reminding myself that revenge isn't about rage, it is about precision, and the most powerful thing I could do was not scream into the phone or post something online, but to take all the little pieces he had handed me over the years and line them up so that the fall would be unavoidable. The fact that he thought freezing Ryan's tuition would corner me only showed me how blind he had become, and blindness in men like Mark is always the opening for something greater. When Ryan texted later that night, asking if there was any update, I told him to trust me and focus on his work, because I was handling it, and although he didn't know it yet, the real handling had already begun. I had the folder, I had his father's words on record, and I had no intention of letting this go quietly. What Mark saw as a clever punishment was about to become the trigger that finally set the rest of my plan in motion, and when it landed, he would not even know where the first crack had started. By the time the sun dragged itself into something that felt like another ordinary weekday, which it absolutely was not, I had made peace with the part of me that used to hold out hope that Mark might one day decide to be the father he enjoyed pretending to be in rooms full of strangers, because the moment I reopened that old folder and let the paper speak, I remembered in a very practical, unromantic way that he had always been a man who liked the appearance of generosity more than the effort of consistency, and that every time I had believed his promises I ended up negotiating with a ghost that only showed up when witnesses were nearby. So instead of replaying last night's calls, I sat there and laid out the past like a timeline you would pin to a corkboard, not because I needed to wallow, but because I needed to remember the rhythm of his neglect in order to cut through it cleanly. There was the year he decided that child support was an optional courtesy because he had decided a new car would make clients take him more seriously. And there were the spring months he managed to be sick for every parent meeting, but somehow healthy enough for 3 golf tournaments and a networking retreat. And there was the birthday he sent a group text with a photo of a wrapped box that Ryan never actually received, a little slideshow of intention without delivery that he paraded whenever anyone questioned his effort, and even though I kept the receipts and the court notes and the emails stamped with dates and names, what I really kept was the lesson that people like him are allergic to steady responsibility. Which is why I stopped expecting steady and started building safety that did not need his permission to exist. I never told Ryan about the account I opened at the credit union in my maiden name, the one that skimmed a quiet slice of every freelance check and every tax refund and every overtime deposit I could squeeze out of weekends. Because I understood that a plan only qualifies as a backup when it can survive daylight and pressure without collapsing into arguments about fairness, and I named that account something boring so it would not draw questions. And when the balance hit a threshold that felt like breathing room rather than a fantasy number, I sat down with my friend Grace, who is not a wizard, but is a meticulous bookkeeper who believes in signatures and witnessed forms. And we set up an education trust with Grace as the temporary trustee and a trigger clause that would make disbursements automatic if interference occurred from any non-custodial parent. Which sounds dramatic until you remember that dramatic is just another word for prepared when the other person insists on chaos. The trust was not a miracle and it did not make me rich, but it did something better, because it took the air out of Mark's favorite game, which was to make everything feel last minute so he could play savior when it suited him and executioner when it did not. And while he was busy posturing about investors and respect, I was busy printing the letter that authorized the first semester's bridge payment directly to the bursar, and I walked that letter to the branch and sat with a woman who has been behind that glass for as long as I have been a mother, and who did not need my entire history to understand that what we were doing was about stability, not revenge, even though I will admit it tasted like both when the receipt landed in my hand. I did not tell Ryan right away, because I have learned that it is a special kind of cruelty to keep a kid on a roller coaster of updates when the ride is still moving. So instead I sent him one message that said to go to class, to keep his head down, and to trust me for one more day, and then I forwarded the disbursement confirmation to the bursar with a polite request to reinstate his enrollment while the investigation into the freeze moved forward, and within the hour I received a reply that balanced compassion with policy in that practiced university tone, which is fine by me because I do not need warmth from institutions, I need compliance, and we were halfway there. If the bridge payment was the quiet solution, the second part of my morning was the part where I allowed myself to be strategic in a way that I had postponed for too many years, because while Mark had been dramatic about punishing Ryan, he had also been careless about how he touched accounts that did not belong to him, and I had copies of those touches preserved like fingerprints on glass, so I drafted a brief, not emotional but precise, with dates and instrument numbers and the language from our decree that a lawyer once told me was unusually clear, and I sent that brief not just to the university compliance office, but to the legal department at his firm, which I had never contacted before because I do not like to cross streams. But there is a page in our decree that says interference with educational funds constitutes contempt, and there is a clause in his employment contract, which I have thanks to an old insurance filing, that requires executives to disclose any legal actions that could reflect on fiduciary responsibility. I would be lying if I said my hands did not shake a little when I hit send, not because I doubted the choice, but because I understood the size of it, and I heard my own mother's voice in my head telling me to keep family business in the family. Then I remembered that Mark had already broken that rule by dragging our son's tuition into his ego war, so I closed that voice out and opened another tab, the one for the hotline that deals with misrepresentations and conflicts of interest, and I wrote a report that did not accuse him of crimes he did not commit, but did lay out the pattern of using shared accounts and then claiming ignorance, and I attached the bank's preliminary audit notice that my fraud inquiry had triggered, and I signed my name. Because I am not hiding and I am not bluffing. When Ryan finally called between classes and said that the registrar had told him a payment had posted and his schedule was safe for now, he sounded like someone who had just taken a breath after being held underwater. And he asked me how I had done it and whether it was going to explode into something bigger with his father, and I told him that tuition was handled and that he should focus on his assignments and show up for himself, and that the rest was adult business, which was the truth and also a way to buy time while the fuse I had just lit burned toward the pile of dry kindling Mark had built around his reputation without noticing the smell of smoke. When I hung up, the calls began again. First the unknown number that always turns out to be him behind a blocked line, then the office line. Then a text from a colleague of his I barely remember from a company holiday event years ago asking if I had a minute to talk, and I let them all stack up without answering. Because the one thing Mark never imagined I would touch was the image he polishes for work, and I had just placed my hand on the edge of it and given it the slightest, most polite push. By the time the university compliance officer returned my message and asked for a short call followed by a secure upload of whatever supporting materials I had already decided that this would not be one of those drawn-out tug-of-wars where Mark exhausts everyone until the only thing left standing is his version of events. So I brewed coffee I did not really want, opened the folder again, and began building a clean timeline that any stranger could read without needing me to narrate. Because I knew that if I made it simple enough for a policy person to follow, it would also be simple enough for his employer to recognize as a liability, which in my experience moves faster than sympathy ever does. I told Ryan to swing by the house after his afternoon class, not because I needed his permission to go forward, but because I refused to make him a prop in my plan. And when he sat down at the kitchen table looking like someone who slept with his shoes on just to be ready for the next alarm, I laid out the facts with the kind of careful tone you use when you are trying to keep a bridge open even while warning about the fire underneath it, explaining that the freeze on his account did not come from the school, that it was pushed through by a third-party access that his father had been granted for invoicing only, that I had revoked that access, and that the trust had already bridged the payment so his classes were safe. And then I showed him a few selected documents that proved a pattern of interference without dragging him through every sordid detail, because I wanted him informed without being poisoned, which is a thin line but a necessary one. He asked the question any kid asks when the mask finally slips, which is whether he should go confront his father and demand that he stop, and I told him as gently as I could that yelling at a man who prides himself on control only feeds the machine. That what we needed now was not a scene but a record, and that I was taking care of the record in a way he might not love but would understand when he was older, and he looked at me for a long beat with a mix of gratitude and grief, then nodded and said he would trust me even though every muscle in his body wanted to drive across town and bang on a door. While he did his homework at the table like he was back in high school, I finished assembling the packet that would do the speaking for us. And I sent it first to the university's compliance inbox with a straightforward cover note that referenced their policy on parental interference and attached the recorded transcript of Mark's little lecture about humility, the screenshots from the portal showing the access he misused, and the bank's audit notice that had been triggered by my fraud inquiry. Then I drafted a second version for his company addressed to the general counsel and the chair of the audit committee, with a short explanation that I was not seeking damages from them, but believed they needed to be aware that an executive who signs off on other people's money had just been documented manipulating educational funds in his own household, which at a minimum raised questions about judgment and at worst raised questions about compliance, and I sent that too, signing my name in full, and including a number where they could reach me during business hours. For years, I had convinced myself that bringing his employer into anything would be too messy, too personal, too likely to backfire. Yet as I watched those documents leave my outbox, I felt something I had not felt in a long time, which was not anger and not relief, but the steadiness that comes from finally acting in the same language your opponent uses, because Mark loves policy when it protects him and calls it petty when it constrains him. And I had just put policy on my side of the scale, which is where it belongs when you are the one keeping the receipts. I called my attorney next, a woman who has never needed to raise her voice to terrify a man who thinks consequences are optional, and I asked for an emergency motion to enforce the educational clause and to sanction interference, and while she began drafting, I reached out to the state office that oversees misuse of tax-advantaged education funds, not to accuse him of crimes I could not prove, but to ask for a review of withdrawals and contributions from any account that had been represented to a court as dedicated to our son's schooling, and I gave them the same neat timeline and the same attachments, because if there is one thing bureaucracy understands, it is repetition, and I was ready to repeat myself as often as necessary. Late in the afternoon, the first reply hit my inbox from the university, a careful note acknowledging receipt and confirming that a hold had been placed on all third-party actions pending investigation, with a promise that any attempt to tamper again would be escalated to their legal department. And minutes later, a second email arrived from an assistant to the general counsel at his firm requesting a call to verify details and asking for permission to share my materials with their outside auditors, which I granted without hesitation, and while I was still reading that, my phone lit up with an unknown number followed by another unknown number followed by his office line followed by the personal cell I know too well, and then the texts began. A jumble of bluster and concern and that condescending plea he thinks sounds reasonable, telling me I was overreacting and that this was a family matter and that I should remember who pays the big bills, and I let each message arrive and sit unopened, like junk mail in a hallway. Ryan looked up from his laptop and asked me if everything was okay, and I told him that what he was hearing was not danger, it was the sound of accountability finally realizing it had a pulse, and that he should go finish his work and worry about dinner. Because I had one more letter to send before I let the day land, a short, formal notice to Mark's counsel that an emergency hearing date had been requested and that any contact about the tuition or the trust should go through my attorney, and I put my phone face down and listened as it vibrated across the wooden counter like it was trying to crawl back into his pocket, which it would not tonight. Not until the people he wanted to impress were done reading the packet that finally taught them how he behaves when no one is watching, and by the time the sun dropped and the kitchen dimmed, The missed calls on my screen had multiplied into a small forest I had no intention of walking into, because the next voice he would hear from this house would be on a recorded line in a room where paper does the talking and feelings do not get a vote. When the morning of the hearing finally arrived, I was already 2 steps ahead because the university had reinstated Ryan's enrollment with full notation that the tuition freeze was unauthorized. The trust had been activated in such a way that no signature from Mark could ever interfere again, and his company's legal counsel had quietly begun its own inquiry after reviewing the packet I had sent, which meant that even before a judge walked into the room, the walls around his carefully polished image were beginning to crack, not because I shouted louder than him, but because paper has a way of shouting for you once it finds the right audience, and this time I had made sure it was speaking in every direction at once. Mark arrived late, with that slightly rumpled look men like him wear when they want to sell the story that they have been too busy running the world to worry about small domestic matters. But what he failed to notice was that the judge had already skimmed the timeline. The auditor had already sent over a preliminary finding of irregularities in the accounts, and the compliance officer from the university had filed a supporting affidavit confirming that the freeze was initiated by him directly. So when his attorney tried to paint this as a misunderstanding, the judge leaned forward with that look that means patience is already running on fumes, and I did not need to say a word because the paper kept talking louder than either of us could. The ruling was swift and almost anticlimactic in tone, because in family court language, contempt does not come with fireworks, it comes with clear instructions and deadlines, and the judge ordered the immediate restoration of funds, sanctions against further interference, and reimbursement for the fees incurred to secure Ryan's enrollment. But the part that mattered most was the final line, the one that required notification to his employer of the finding of interference with educational funds. Because while Mark can shrug off a lecture in chambers, he cannot shrug off an HR department that suddenly sees liability when they look at him, and the flicker in his eyes when that line was read was the closest thing to fear I had ever seen him allow to surface. Ryan sat quietly in the back, not because he didn't care, but because I had told him beforehand that this was not his fight to carry. And when the judge's gavel came down, he looked at me with the same expression he used to wear when he was little and realized I had patched something broken before he even knew it was cracked, and in that moment I felt the weight of every late-night calculation, every quiet deposit into the backup account, every hour spent documenting instead of sleeping, all of it stacking into a single truth that I had not just protected his future, I had dismantled the illusion Mark had built brick by brick. By the time we walked out of that courthouse, Mark was already on the phone, pacing in tight circles with that sharp edge in his voice he usually reserves for subordinates, and I knew he was calling every contact he had to try and contain the damage. But damage has a way of spreading faster when the people who used to admire you suddenly smell weakness, and by late afternoon I had 3 different messages from people I barely knew inside his company thanking me for my documentation and confirming that internal reviews had been escalated, which told me everything I needed to know about how seriously they were taking it, because gratitude in corporate language is often the first sign that someone is preparing to cut ties. That evening, Ryan and I sat at the table eating takeout, and for the first time in weeks his voice sounded lighter, not because he thought everything was fixed forever, but because he could finally focus on his own life without bracing for the next strike. And he asked me if I thought his father would try something again, and I told him the truth, which is that men like Mark rarely learn. They just shift tactics, but that this time we had closed enough doors to limit his reach, and that more importantly, Ryan now had proof that when his father tried to weaponize control, his mother had already built a fortress around him. The calls kept coming that night, one after another, his personal cell, his office line, even blocked numbers, each one lighting up the screen with the desperation of a man who suddenly realizes the role of puppeteer no longer belongs to him. And I let them all stack into silence, because I had no intention of giving him the one thing he wanted most, which was my attention, and instead I recorded a short voicemail, less than 20 seconds long, delivered in the same steady voice I had used in court, telling him that the accounts were no longer his to touch. The university had his words on record. his employer had the documents in hand, and that if he needed to speak further, he should do so through his lawyer. But that as far as Ryan and I were concerned, the conversation was over. I ended the message with one final line, not raised, not angry, just surgical, telling him that he had wanted to teach our son a lesson about earning his future, and that in the process, he had taught him something else entirely. That a man who confuses control with love eventually loses both, and I hung up without waiting to see if the system would confirm delivery, because I knew he would listen to it. And I knew he would understand that silence after a sentence like that is not retreat, it is closure. When I set the phone down and looked across the table at Ryan, who was scrolling through notes for his class the next morning with his head finally clear enough to focus, I realized that I did not need Mark to collapse completely to call this a win. Because the collapse had already happened in the only place that mattered, which was the trust between father and son, and no ruling or audit or internal memo could glue that back together. For once, justice had not arrived in the form of pity or apology. It had arrived in the form of preparation, precision, and timing, and while Mark would keep dialing numbers until his voice went hoarse, he would never get the last call he wanted. Because I had already made sure the only voice echoing in his head was mine, calm, final, and entirely in control.